The moment I collapsed on the floor, the entire room went silent. Just seconds earlier, my parents had rolled their eyes and called me a drama queen. 25 people were sitting around the hall, watching the scene unfold, and my parents had already decided I was just pretending. But when my vision blurred and my body suddenly gave out beneath me, something changed. My name is Lily Anderson. I'm 25 years old, and that day was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. Growing up, I was always known as the sensitive one in my family. If I cried during a movie, my father would laugh and say I was too emotional. If I complained about feeling sick, my mother would usually respond with the same line she had used for years. "You're exaggerating again, Lily." At first, I thought it was normal. Every family has its own way of communicating, right? But over time, something strange began to happen. No matter what I said, no matter how serious the situation was, my parents always assumed I was being dramatic. If I said I felt dizzy, they said I needed fresh air. If I said I had a headache, they said I needed more sleep. If I said something hurt, they said I was overreacting. Eventually, I stopped talking about my health altogether, because what was the point? Still, life moved forward. I finished college, started working part-time at a small marketing company, and slowly began building my own life. I wasn't rich, and I didn't have everything figured out yet, but I was proud of how far I had come. Then came the Sunday family gathering. It wasn't a special holiday or anything like that. My parents simply liked hosting these small weekly dinners. Relatives, family, friends, and neighbors would come over, usually around 20 or 25 people. I never enjoyed those gatherings very much. They were loud, crowded, and exhausting, but my parents insisted I attend whenever I could. "Family appearances matter," my father always said. So that Sunday afternoon, I drove over to their house like usual. The living room was already full when I arrived. People were talking, laughing, and carrying plates of food from the kitchen to the long dining table. My mother waved at me from across the room. "There you are," she said. "Go greet everyone." I forced a small smile and walked around the room, saying hello to relatives and neighbors I barely knew. Everything seemed normal, but after about 30 minutes, something started to feel wrong. At first, it was just a small wave of dizziness. I tried to ignore it. Maybe I was just tired, but the feeling didn't go away. Instead, it slowly got worse. My vision started to blur slightly, and the room began to feel strangely warm. I sat down at the edge of the couch and took a slow breath. My cousin noticed. "You okay?" she asked. "I think I just need some water," I said. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen. Halfway there, the dizziness became stronger. My head felt heavy. My legs felt weak. I grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter for support. My mother looked over from the stove. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I feel a little dizzy," I said quietly. She sighed immediately. "Oh, please, Lily." My father turned from the table. "Not again." I blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" "You always do this," he said. "Do what?" "Turn every small moment into a big scene." Several people nearby had started watching us. "I'm not trying to make a scene," I said. "I just feel really lightheaded." My mother shook her head. "You're being dramatic again." The word stung. "I'm serious," I said. "Something doesn't feel right." My father laughed lightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly to the room, "our family drama queen has arrived." A few people chuckled awkwardly. My face burned with embarrassment. "I'm not joking," I said quietly, but they had already decided. In their minds, I was exaggerating, just like always. The dizziness suddenly intensified. The room tilted slightly. "I think I need to sit down," I said. My father waved his hand dismissively. "Just go lie down somewhere and stop interrupting everyone." I took one step backward, then another, but suddenly my legs stopped cooperating. My vision darkened around the edges. Voices around me became distant and muffled, and before I could say another word, my body collapsed onto the floor. The sound echoed through the room, and suddenly, 25 people were staring at me in complete silence. But the most shocking part wasn't the fact that I had collapsed. It was what my parents did next. Instead of rushing toward me, they simply stood there. "Mi father sahil." And my mother said something that made the entire room freeze. "She'll get up in a minute," she said calmly. "She's just being dramatic again." For a few seconds after I collapsed, everything felt strangely quiet. My body was lying on the cold floor. but my mind was still aware of what was happening around me. Voices sounded distant, like they were coming from the other end of a long tunnel. Someone gasped. A chair scraped loudly across the floor. But the voices I heard most clearly were my parents. "She'll get up," my mother said calmly. My father chuckled softly. "Give her a minute." Their words floated above me while I struggled to move. I wanted to sit up. I wanted to say something, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My arms felt heavy. My vision was still dark around the edges, and my heartbeat was racing in a strange, uneven rhythm. That was when someone else spoke. "I don't think she's pretending." The voice sounded concerned. I recognized it after a moment. It was Mrs. Parker, one of our neighbors who had known my family for years. Another voice followed. "Her face looks really pale." Footsteps approached quickly. Someone knelt beside me. "Lily, can you hear me?" I tried to respond, but only a faint sound escaped my lips. "Yes," the woman said urgently. "She's definitely not okay." Meanwhile, my parents still hadn't moved. I could hear my father sigh again. "She does this every time she wants attention." That sentence caused a ripple of uncomfortable murmurs throughout the room. 25 people had witnessed me collapsing, and now 25 people were watching my parents ignore it. Another person spoke, this time with more urgency. "Should we call an ambulance?" My mother responded immediately. "No, that's not necessary." Someone sounded surprised. "She just fainted." "She didn't faint," my mother said firmly. "She's being dramatic." The words hit me even through the fog in my head. Even now, they believed I was pretending. But the people around me were starting to react differently. I felt someone gently touch my shoulder. "Her pulse is really fast," a man said. "Is anyone here medically trained?" another voice asked. "Yes," someone replied. "I'm a nurse." The room suddenly became more active. Footsteps moved quickly around me. The nurse knelt down beside me and carefully checked my breathing. "Lily," she said calmly, "I need you to stay still, okay?" I tried to nod slightly. "She's very pale," the nurse said to the others, "and her breathing is shallow." That sentence finally seemed to shift the mood in the room. Concern replaced curiosity. Several people moved closer. Someone brought a glass of water. Another person grabbed a pillow and placed it under my head. Meanwhile, my parents still hadn't come any closer. From across the room, my father spoke again. "She's going to be embarrassed when she realizes how big of a scene she made." The nurse looked up sharply. "Sir," she said firmly, "your daughter needs medical attention." My father shrugged. "She just wants attention." The silence that followed felt heavy. I could almost feel the shock spreading through the room. 25 people were now witnessing something none of them had expected. Parents refusing to help their own daughter. Finally, someone spoke with a serious tone. "I'm calling an ambulance." My mother sounded annoyed. "That's really unnecessary." But the person had already pulled out their phone. Within seconds, they were speaking to emergency services. "Yes," they said urgently. "A young woman collapsed and she's not responding properly." The nurse stayed beside me the entire time. "Stay with me, Lily," she said gently. I tried to focus on her voice. The dizziness was still overwhelming, but now I could hear more clearly what people around me were saying. Whispers filled the room. "Why aren't her parents helping? I've never seen anything like this. Something's really wrong." My chest felt tight, and each breath seemed slightly harder than the last. The nurse noticed immediately. "Her breathing is getting worse," she said. Someone near the window suddenly spoke. "I hear sirens." A wave of tension moved through the room. The ambulance was coming, and suddenly, the entire situation felt very real, even for my parents. My mother's voice sounded nervous now. Maybe she really is sick. But the damage had already been done. 25 people had already seen everything. They had seen me collapse. They had seen my parents dismiss it, and now they were about to see something even more shocking. Because as the paramedics rushed through the front door moments later, one of them took a quick look at me and said something that made the entire room fall completely silent. "This isn't fainting," he said urgently. "She's in serious medical distress." The moment the paramedic said the words, "serious medical distress," the atmosphere in the room changed completely. Only a few minutes earlier, people had been chatting, eating, and laughing. Now the entire house was silent. I could hear the quick movements of the paramedics as they knelt beside me. One of them gently lifted my wrist, checking my pulse. Another opened a small medical bag and started preparing equipment. "Her pulse is irregular," one of them said. "Blood pressure is dropping," the other replied. The nurse who had been helping me stepped aside so they could work. What happened? One of the paramedics asked the room. Several people started talking at once. She said she felt dizzy. She collapsed suddenly. She looked really pale. The paramedic nodded while attaching a small monitor to my finger. Then he looked up and asked the most obvious question. Where are her parents? For a brief moment, no one answered. Then someone awkwardly pointed across the room. My parents were still standing near the dining table. They hadn't moved closer. The paramedic looked confused. You're her parents? He asked. My father crossed his arms. Yes. The paramedic's expression hardened slightly. How long was she feeling unwell before collapsing? My father shrugged. She said she felt dizzy. And she tends to exaggerate things. A ripple of uncomfortable whispers moved through the crowd again. The paramedic glanced briefly at the other guests, clearly sensing the tension in the room. Then he focused back on me. Lily, he said gently, can you hear me? I tried to respond. My voice came out weak. Yes, good. Stay with us. He quickly looked at his partner. We need to get her to the hospital. Those words finally seemed to alarm my parents. Hospital? My mother said. Is that really necessary? The paramedic looked up at her. Yes, he said firmly. Her symptoms are serious. Another paramedic was already preparing a stretcher near the door. People stepped aside to make space. I felt careful hands lifting me slightly. Everything felt slow and distant, but I could still hear the conversations happening around me, and what I heard made the situation even more uncomfortable. Someone whispered loudly enough for others to hear. Why didn't her parents help her earlier? Another voice answered quietly. They thought she was pretending. The silence that followed was heavy, because now everyone in that room knew the truth. 25 people had watched my parents dismiss my condition, and now those same people were watching paramedics rush me to the hospital. As they carefully placed me onto the stretcher, the nurse spoke again. You did the right thing calling the ambulance, she told the guests. Then she glanced toward my parents, but she didn't say anything to them. The paramedics began wheeling me toward the door. The ceiling lights passed slowly above me as they moved. I heard footsteps following us. Several people from the gathering had come outside. Concerned voices filled the cool evening air. Is she going to be okay? Do they know what's wrong? The paramedic answered calmly. We'll know more once she gets to the hospital. But before they loaded me into the ambulance, something unexpected happened. One of the guests spoke loudly. Her parents should ride with her. The statement hung in the air. Everyone turned to look at them. It seemed like the obvious thing. If someone collapses and is rushed to the hospital, their parents usually go with them. But my parents didn't move. My father cleared his throat. We'll meet her there. The paramedic looked surprised. You don't want to come with us? My mother shook her head slightly. There are still guests here. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence felt almost unbelievable. 25 people were standing in the front yard, and they had just heard parents refuse to ride in the ambulance with their own daughter. Finally, the paramedic nodded slowly. All right, he said. But his expression clearly showed what he thought about that decision. The ambulance doors closed. The siren started moments later. As the vehicle began moving, I felt the motion beneath me and heard the steady beeping of the monitor beside me. One of the paramedics sat next to me. You're going to be okay, he said calmly. I wanted to believe him, but even through the dizziness and confusion, one painful thought kept repeating in my mind. 25 people had just seen the truth about my parents. They had seen how quickly my parents dismissed me, how easily they called me dramatic, how little concern they showed even when I collapsed. And somehow, I had the feeling that what happened in that house that evening was only the beginning, because once 25 people witness something like that, the truth doesn't stay hidden for very long. The ride to the hospital felt both fast and endless at the same time. The ambulance siren echoed through the streets while the paramedics worked quietly beside me. One of them was monitoring my heartbeat, while the other checked my blood pressure again. Stay awake if you can, the paramedic beside me said calmly. I nodded weakly. My head still felt heavy, but the fog in my mind was slowly beginning to clear. What happened? I asked quietly. You collapsed, he replied. I remember that. You were having serious symptoms, he explained. Your pulse was very irregular when we arrived. The word irregular made me uneasy. Is it serious? I asked. We're not sure yet, he said honestly. The doctors at the hospital will run some tests. I closed my eyes for a moment. The flashing ambulance lights reflected faintly through the windows. And despite everything happening around me, one painful thought kept returning. My parents hadn't come with me. Most people rush to the hospital with their loved ones in situations like this, but my parents had stayed behind to finish hosting their dinner. Even thinking about it made my chest feel heavy. The ambulance slowed as we approached the hospital. A few minutes later, the doors opened and bright lights filled my vision. "All right, Lily," one of the paramedics said gently. "We're here." They carefully wheeled the stretcher through the emergency entrance. Doctors and nurses were already waiting. "What do we have?" a doctor asked quickly. "Female, mid-20s, the paramedic responded. "Collapsed suddenly. Irregular pulse, dizziness, weakness." The medical staff immediately began moving with practice speed. Within seconds, I was surrounded by people checking monitors, adjusting equipment, and asking questions. "Lily, can you hear me?" the doctor asked. "Yes," I whispered. "Good. We're going to run some tests." I nodded faintly. They wheeled me into a quiet examination room, and the next hour felt like a blur of tests and questions. Blood samples, heart monitoring, more questions about my symptoms. Finally, the doctor returned after reviewing some results. He pulled a chair beside the bed. "Lily," he said calmly, "you're stable now." Relief washed over me. "But we believe you experienced a severe cardiac episode," he continued. My heart skipped slightly. "A cardiac episode?" "Yes," he explained. "Your heart rhythm became dangerously irregular. That's likely what caused you to collapse." I stared at him. "But I'm only 25. He nodded. "It's rare, but it does happen." He continued explaining that they would need to run more tests to understand the exact cause. But the important thing was that I had received help quickly. "If those people hadn't called the ambulance when they did," the doctor said carefully, "the situation could have become much worse." The sentence lingered in the air. I knew exactly what he meant. If the guests hadn't taken my condition seriously, my parents certainly wouldn't have. The thought sent a chill through me. About 30 minutes later, a nurse walked into the room. "There are a few people asking about you," she said. I looked surprised. "Who?" "Some of the guests from the gathering you were at." My chest tightened slightly. "They came here?" She nodded. "Yes." They seemed very concerned. A strange mixture of emotions filled me. Gratitude, embarrassment, and something else I couldn't quite describe. The nurse hesitated for a moment before asking another question. "Your parents haven't arrived yet. Should we contact them?" I looked down at my hands. For several seconds, I didn't answer, because the truth was painfully obvious. If 25 people had watched me collapse, and if those same 25 people had watched my parents dismiss it, then my parents already knew exactly where I was. And yet, hours had passed, but they still hadn't come. Finally, I looked back at the nurse. "It's okay," I said quietly. "You don't need to call them." She nodded gently, and as she left the room, I realized something important. That Sunday evening had changed everything. 25 people had seen the truth about my parents. But more importantly, for the first time in my life, I had seen it clearly too. And once you see something like that, it becomes impossible to pretend it isn't real anymore. I spent the night in the hospital under observation. Machines quietly monitored my heartbeat while nurses checked on me every couple of hours. The doctors wanted to make sure my heart rhythm stayed stable. Physically, I was starting to feel better. Emotionally, though, everything felt different. The events from that Sunday kept replaying in my mind. The dizziness, the collapse, the paramedics rushing into the house. But the part that stayed with me the most was something else. 25 people had watched my parents dismiss me, and even hours later, my parents still hadn't come to the hospital. Around mid-morning, the doctor returned to my room with more information. He explained that my heart had experienced something called a severe arrhythmia episode. It meant that my heartbeat had suddenly become dangerously irregular. "It can happen for different reasons," he said calmly. "Stress, exhaustion, dehydration, or sometimes underlying conditions. But the important thing," he added, "is that you received medical help quickly." I nodded slowly. If the guests hadn't reacted the way they did, things could have ended very differently. The doctor left after reminding me that I would need follow-up appointments and some lifestyle adjustments. After he left, the room became quiet again. About an hour later, the nurse returned.